Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and today we're going to talk about 3 books in particular. Those are the first 3 novels of Thomas Covenant, The Unbeliever, by Stephen R. Donaldson. The first trilogy, Lord Foul's Bane, The Ill-Earth War, and The Power That Preserves. That's what we're going to talk about today. We'll have some non-spoilery stuff at the beginning, and then we'll talk about spoilery things. So let's get started. Cheers. All right. So yeah, can I say, the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, The Unbeliever, are, some of those older fantasy books that have been around for a long time. Everyone knows about them. I'm not sure how many people have actually read them at this point. A lot of authors have read them. And that makes them influential in a lot of ways that other books that we maybe talk about more these days are not. So, what are those in a non-spoilery way, and should you go and read them? Well, the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, The Unbeliever, those first 3 at least, are epic fantasy. They're also portal fantasy, that being Thomas Covenant is a writer, and he gets dragged into a fantasy world. Conveniently named The Land, and discovers that his wedding ring has magical powers there. And he has to do stuff in the land before he returns to his existence out here in the real world, which sucks. I mean, his existence in our world sucks because he's got leprosy, and those of you who know what leprosy is will say, "Wow, a fantastic death metal album," and you're right. But you'll also say, "Wow, people are rotting," and that's not cool. So that's basically the very, very short description of what goes on. He has to go to the land, help the people of the land to to actually defeat Lord Foul, the Despiser, and goes on adventures there. And they're epic fantasy adventures. They're deliberately modeled after or in discourse or conversation with Lord of the Rings, so having read Lord of the Rings will help. And, I mean, generally you should go and read Lord of the Rings anyway, because, those are pretty good books. Anyway, so that's what you get. You get, fairly flowery prose. You get a lot of, very emotionally taxing stuff. And this is sort of where we go, should you read this or should you not read this? Yes, you should read this if you're interested in the history of fantasy, in the history of epic fantasy in particular. If you like epic fantasy, then yes, you should read it in general. It is really good. It deals with a lot of questions of the human condition in particular, and that's something that I would argue makes books generally better. And in that regard, I think it is one of the first epic fantasy books that make it very deliberately, make a very deliberate point about how they are about our world, our human existence, and not just about elves and orcs and shit. So that's why you should go and read these books. They're good. No star ratings or anything from me, because, I don't do that crap, but, they're well worth reading, at least the first 3, so you know what this stuff's about. And then you can talk with the big boys, or big girls, or whatever, about, old fantasy books, which is what we do around here. Yeah, why shouldn't you read these books? Or are there trigger warnings? Why, yes, there are. I guess everyone who has heard about the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant will go I know which one is going to come. It's the sexual assault trigger warning. And yes, there is one scene in there that is exactly that. And if these things in general trigger you, then yeah, maybe skip that one, because the consequences of that action echo through the rest of the series. They come back again and again and again. So even if you miss the actual description, which is rather short, you'll still go be reminded that that happened again and again and again. And this brings me to my way more, I don't want to say more important, but definitely the trigger warning that I want to put out here, that maybe gets overlooked from time to time. These books are rough. And they're insanely dark, without having a lot of graphic violence or anything of the sorts. But because they're so much about the mental health and the health of Thomas Covenant, the unbeliever, as a person, and the consequences of having a fatal illness that also, gets him shunned by society. If you're struggling with all kinds of mental health issues and the likes, this stuff can really drag you down. It's like I tried to read the third book and I had to put it down for a week because I just wasn't, I didn't feel well enough to actually tackle that level. And we'll talk about that in the spoilery section in detail. But just want to make this clear. These are dark books. They deal with a lot of stuff that can certainly make you feel really bad if you're struggling with ostracism or struggling with mental health in general. And be aware of that. I still think they're valuable books and extremely important with the things they're trying to say, but, your health comes first, your mental health comes first, and your well-being comes first, so maybe give them a skip if that kind of stuff drags you down. And with that, you know all about the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever, and can go and read them, and then join us when we talk about other elements of those books. Glad you're back. Hope you like the books, or at least took something valuable out of them. That's, I guess, the goal here. So let's talk about these books. And I want to make one thing clear. I struggled with making this video because I was trying to do too much, because there's like 2 essays written by Stephen Donaldson called Epic Fantasy in the Modern World and Epic Fantasy Necessary Literature. And I read those halfway through the trilogy. And I wanted to integrate the stuff that Donaldson says about what he's doing with epic fantasy in this video, and I didn't know how to do that. So what I decided to do is I'll make this video all about the books, not about the essays, and then I'll try to make another video where we'll go through those essays. Philip Chase has a video on them as well. He called it the Literature of Reintegration, and yeah, you should go and watch that video as well. And then I'll make a video and talk about those essays. We'll go through them, look at like his grand thesis or whatever he's trying to do, Stephen Donaldson, that is, and then we'll look at how he accomplishes or maybe fails in, reaching those goals, achieving those goals with the first Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever. That's my plan. Will that happen? I don't know. Ask me when I've made the second video. But today we're only talking about the books, what they meant to me, how they worked, what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, because there are weaknesses in here, and, stuff like that. All right, and let's talk about the strength. And yeah, the strength is clearly the darkness of these books, and the fact that what happens to Thomas Covenant in the land is in reply to or an extension to his situation in our world. Now, here's the thing. Thomas Covenant is defined by his leprosy, whether he wants to or not. And I'm not quite sure. I guess it would be interesting to ask Stephen Donaldson that, or maybe he has talked about it before, and I don't know because I don't read writer interviews. But leprosy as as Thomas Covenant's defining illness is obviously a very powerful choice, but if feel like it may no longer work as much as it did in the 70s when he published the book. So my guess was that, if it was written in the 80s, he'd probably taken HIV instead of leprosy as the illness, which does, fulfill the same level of being ostracized by society, being basically cut off human society for a condition that you don't have, that you're not responsible for, because people assume that you're responsible for them, in a way. But then, of course, leprosy is a very powerful idea in that it has been around for a long, long time, and you can make a lot of references to leprosy through the Middle Ages, through biblical verse and stuff like that. You can do all of that. And there's a lot of symbols in these books, right? Like the whole thing of Thomas the Unbeliever, or doubting Thomas, so to speak, is obviously a biblical reference. The word covenant is one that we most often encounter in a biblical context of although it of course has other meanings. I mean, not other meanings, but can be used for all kinds of like compacts and whatever treatises use covenants. So there is that level of where leprosy works as an illness. It's also obviously very, a strong image, a strong metaphor for how someone basically dies slowly from the outside. All of that stuff. And that brings us to one of the most important things here, right? That being, Thomas Covenant gets cut off human society. And that's something that we've learned in other ways before, and we should all be aware of. Being ostracized, being thrown out of society, being deprived of human interaction, like face-to-face human interaction, has dire consequences. There's a wonderful quote by Terry Pratchett somewhere when he talks, I think it's in Men at Arms, when he talks about how humans are, like, people are not full paid up members of the human race just by living. They need to be bounced around in the Brownian motion of society. And, that's Pratchett making it like light and using his very specific type of metaphor there. But the point is exactly that we need to have contact with other people to be actually alive. And there's a difference between living and surviving. And that's one that comes up again and again in these books. So we have that idea of Thomas Covenant suffering incredible pain just by being cut off society, being basically deprived of his humanity, being dehumanized in all kinds of ways by society and society's reflexes to, be persecuting in a lot of ways. And there's a wonderful book by, what's his name, Moore. I keep forgetting his first name. It might be Robert. Anyway, the point is, the book is called The Beginning of the Invention of a Persecuting Society, and it's about leprosy and how people dealt with it in the Middle Ages. It's a non-fiction book. It's an academic text, actually. It's a fantastic book that you should read if you're interested in like how society changed in like the 1200s or something, somewhere around that time, and persecution of non-conforming, so to speak, elements of society became integral of our society. So anyway, my point was a different one. I'm rambling already, but my point is that Thomas Covenant is deprived of his humanity in that way, and he has internalized that. And when he comes to the land, that's exactly where we see all these things opposite. The land is a place where people look after each other, where you have that covenant, where society works in that ideal way, where people have empathy and compassion, even in cases where it's very hard to have that. It's perfect in that regard, and that's like the ongoing conflict in these novels, right? Is that Thomas Covenant, having that background, having internalized the persecution, having internalized that disenfranchisement, that ostracism from society, is more or less incapable of accepting or living back. He's become so far pushed so far away from actual humanity in a way that he struggles with actually regaining that level of just being human in a way. And I think that's like one of the chief ideas of these books. The term alienation is obviously one that we need to drop here, and we'll come to in that second video if I ever make it. But yeah, that's like the key conflict there. Is like, can someone who has been shown the ugliest side of humanity, the ugliest side of society, of his society in this case, can that person actually come back? Is there a form of redemption, and how could that redemption be? Can we actually move back there? Is that possible? That's the question. That's the challenge of the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, the Unbeliever. And that's something that I found personally like very, very difficult to read, because while I'm obviously very privileged in a lot of ways, and I don't have leprosy, which is good. But the point is, having a visible disability, physical disability, does, I feel, sometimes at least give me the feeling of, being, excluded from parts of human life, of society in a lot of ways. Because that, the trend of pushing out people that are visibly unwell is obviously rooted in some form of psychology or even biology out there in behavior that I don't understand. I don't claim to understand, but it's instinctively in there. And while I would never compare myself to Thomas Covenant in any like way, and would never want, put upon myself like say that I'm ostracized by society or anything like that, there is always that thought, and that's I think the danger or the thing that like Stephen R. Donaldson is actually looking at. And that is, no matter how brutal or even imaginary that disenfranchisement, that cutting off is, the trick is, or the danger is, that we internalize that. We feel ostracized. We feel pushed away by society, and that makes it harder and harder to accept any form of help, to accept any form of any form of human interaction that does not actually conform to our expectations, which we have obviously built up for all kinds of reasons, and that made it very, very hard for me to read, because as much as I don't like Thomas Covenant, there's always a bit of myself in there that I see in Thomas Covenant when I'm reading these books, and I'm like, oh gods, am I really this annoying? Am I this whiny? Am I this whingy? And do I actually have a reason? Because with Thomas Covenant, it's fairly clear that he has a lot of reasons to, feel sorry for himself and the world. He really gets no breaks whatsoever in these books. But that's part of what made it very, very hard for me to read. But I think it's also part of what makes these books so valuable and so extremely important in what they're trying to say about us, how we deal with adversity, how we deal with being cut off by society for things. And this is the important bit here, but both with like whatever my situation is or the situation of Thomas Covenant, we are not responsible for that. There is that like idea when we rationalize how people, when we rationalize people's suffering, there is often that trend where we're like, yeah, but they're to blame. They made this mistake. Thomas Covenant has not made a mistake. That Thomas Covenant's leprosy is not because of any of his mistakes. He does make mistakes, don't get me wrong, but those are different ones. And I think that's an important aspect that is still somewhat underexplored, or not underexplored, like somewhat, it's not accepted yet, the fact that we still kind of intuitively or intuitively blame people for certain health conditions, especially when we move closer into like the mental health area, because we're still, not there when it comes to that kind of discussion. So the fact that Stephen R. Donaldson tackles that very big and complex problem in these books alone is reason to read the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, I would say. It also is, I guess, one of the first, if not the first, piece of epic fantasy literature that does explicitly tackle these topics and kind of moves or open the gates for a lot of epic fantasy writers later on to show the world that yes, you can talk about depression and you can talk about all these things in an epic fantasy story. There's more to it, and you can be open about that, and you can be explicit about that in a lot of ways. I would argue that a story like the Maybe in Memories of Ice by Stephen Erickson would probably not be possible without Stephen R. Donaldson first writing the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant, because yeah, he kind of paved the way there, blazed the trail, so to speak. But now let's look at other aspects of these books. And here we come to I guess the difficult part, or where I would say these books don't work that well for me, or something that I struggled with a lot, and that is the land. I don't like the land. I don't care for the land. The land feels bland, which rhymes, and that's good, right? Point is, the land in a lot of ways does feel somewhat ephemeral, bland. We don't get like that much descriptions, and when we get descriptions, they're kind of archaic in a way and very flowery, but it doesn't always fall fully into place, which could be on purpose, could also be that Tolkien, as a linguist, for example, whom these passages obviously reminded me of, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings descriptions, has more skill or had more skill in actually writing in that specific mode than Stephen R. Donaldson, who is, as far as I know, no scholar of Old English. Who knows? But the other part is, of course, yeah, the land is imaginary. The land is Thomas Covenant in a dream, exploring his mental state, his personality, his conflicts, his inner struggles in a fantasy land. So yeah, of course, it doesn't feel as real as does the those opening chapters and ending sequences when Thomas Covenant is, actually walking around in the land, not the land, walking around in his world, in our world. So I assume that it partly is on purpose, but it made it somewhat difficult for me sometimes to struggle to actually, grapple with the fantasy parts of the story, because they sometimes feel a bit too symbolic and too allegorical. We'll talk about the allegory thing again when we're talking about these essays in that video that I hopefully will make. But while we're having the fantasy world there, it is so full of elements of our world or other fantasies. I was spoken about the fact that it is obviously a deliberate conversation with Lord of the Rings, which is why the ring has magical powers. There's all kinds of things that we see here mirrored that we saw in Tolkien's in Middle Earth, right? We have the Grand Forest that was cut down by humans and turned into fought back and destroyed in a lot of ways. We have, which is a big theme, like the destruction of nature is something that is a huge topic for Tolkien for all kinds of reasons. And Donaldson takes these elements but gives them a different meaning when we connect it so much with Thomas Covenant's psyche in a lot of ways. So we have that element. We have, the the horses. And I love the horses. Don't get me wrong. I love horses, and I think the Ranahin, or whatever the name of those uber horses in this world is, are probably the number one thing that I love about the land are the horses. But that idea of having one society that is inexorably, connected or interlinked with, their horses in a way, that is not your typical, whatever you want to call your horse folk that just raid everyone or whatever. Your Mongol Hun equivalent in fantasy worlds. Well, we have all over the place with all the dark and dirty consequences that has if you just take one culture and still make them your bad guys. You have your Dothraki or whatever those guys are called in Legend by David Gemmell. We have all of that, but no, these are positive horse people. Something that we see with the Rohirrim in Tolkien and in Lord of the Rings, and I would say that they're called Raman and Ranihin. We do have even they sound similar in a way. And we have a lot of that. We have the giant foam follower. He's clearly always talking too long, and he's called hasty or doesn't have long enough stories by his people. It's have we seen that before? Maybe by Yes, we have. And I'm not saying it's, Ogier by Robert Jordan. I obviously mean the Ents in Tolkien with that whole long-lived races suddenly, taking much longer to talk about stuff and things like that. We have those elements. There's a lot of, parallels or nods to Tolkien, but repurposing them or giving them a new perspective in a way, which we have more. We have that sacred place in the middle of the land, and I keep forgetting the name of that place because I'm stupid and I don't look up stuff before I make videos. But where the race stands, and we see that new first spring moon or whatever it's first new moon of spring or whatever, that situation, that celebration of spring that we see in the first chapter and in the first book of Thomas Covenant, in Lord Foul's Bane. We have that part, and that clearly harkens back to ideas that we see in Tolkien, and that sacred place where nature is still fully sacred for everyone. We have all these elements, and they're great. But they are repurposed because they are given connections to our experience that go beyond just like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we had like untouched nature? So what else is interesting? Well, the way it gets darker and darker, and the way that violence is not the final solution for for the problems of Thomas Covenant is something that I appreciated. That we see both in the second and third books. Like, yes, there are battles, and those battles are terrible, but the actual solution is not to just kill everyone, because you can't kill Lord Fowl, and you can just like, you have to find other ways to deal with that. Which, I found very positive, because it's one of those things that I find troubling with a lot of epic fantasy, or a lot of fantasy in general, is that so often violence is the final solution to anything. It's like conflicts are built up, and most of the time they're solved by people swinging huge pieces of metal at each other until one person is lying on the floor. That's basically how it works in a lot of fantasy. But the big ones, like, Lord of the Rings, and this one as well, and others, they're not about killing your enemy. They're actually about something else. Destroying a ring, in this case, Thomas Covenant finding worth in himself again with the wild magic, and finding that it's actually that worth in yourself that is important. It's not having, a magic trinket or anything like that, which is sort of where we end with this book, these books here. That's much more meaningful than just, oh, everyone's dead, let's go home. It doesn't work like that. Unfortunately, yeah, but it doesn't answer the big questions, which epic fantasy should do. What more is there to talk about these books? As I said, I feel the actual quests feel kind of bland, especially in Lord Fowl's Bane, where basically all that happens is everyone walking to the mountain, going down into Khazad Dûm and stealing a staff, in this case. That plot doesn't work that well. And I think that's the weakness for me in a lot of sense with these three books. I don't care for these plots. They're not that interesting. I'm not sitting there on the edge of my seat will they find the Staff of Lords? Whatever, I don't care. I'm interested in how Thomas Covenant is trying to figure out a culture that is completely different to his, and that it actually trusts people and believes in peace and harmony and compassion and empathy, even though he has done something unforgivable, which he believes is unforgivable, and he's right, it is unforgivable, but still people forgive him. And that is super, super interesting to me, and that comes up again and again, and I love those books for that. But will the Dark Lord and his ravers actually, kill everyone? Who cares? I mean, seriously, Revelstone can fall. I don't give a shit. Because I don't give a shit about these characters. They often feel a bit too much as ciphers for one specific thing in a lot of ways. Which, once again, they're supposed to. I just wish they weren't as much, which I think is why someone like Foam Follower does actually stand out as a character so much, because it's that one's cool. He feels real in a way that many of these characters don't. Many of these characters don't feel real. Thomas Covenant feels real in a I don't like that guy way, and Foam Follower feels real. What else is interesting? The intrusion of stuff of our world. And that's really fascinating, because the story is, the way it's set up is the land does have a creator, possibly. Whatever that is I'm still unsure about, whatever. My point is, but people are not sure if there's a creator or whatever. And then we suddenly have those ravers have names from different cultures. They have Semitic names. They have Sanskrit names from Hindu mythology, or at least that background. And then they have names like Satan's Fist. And I'm how does that work? There is no God. There's no Christian religion in this place. How can you call a character Satan's Fist? Doesn't anyone go in the land go what's this Satan whose fist this is? What guy is that? It's I don't know. So that kind of threw me off. But then on the other hand, if The land is basically Thomas Covenant's unconscious, subconscious, or like a mix of Thomas Covenant's subconscious and the collective subconscious, with all these elements of culture and pop culture basically expressing themselves as Thomas Covenant working through his personal issues. Then yeah, maybe the terms make sense in that regard, but it can be kind of, at least for me, it was kind of throwing me off in the beginning. And then I went and read that essay by Donaldson and was like, oh, that's what he's trying to do. I guess I can accept it now. Yeah, but at the end of the day, and I think we'll leave it at that for these books. Like, I like how Stephen R. Donaldson is using a fantasy story to work through important elements of how we should live, how we are living, what price sometimes people pay for living in our society, and having that fantasy as an alternative, having it out there and actively fighting to keep that dream, to keep that other way of having, having things, to keep that alive. And that's I think the important thing, to have hope, to have an idea of how it could be, and to not give in to complete cynicism and say like, well, it's just fantasy, because it's not just fantasy, it's more than that. Fantasy is important, fantasy matters, and that's what, Stephen Donaldson teaches us. And of course, don't hate people. It really doesn't help anyone. And be aware of that. And yeah, actions have consequences. Be aware of that too. Which, are pretty good lessons to learn from a book. So yeah, I didn't enjoy these books, but I'm very glad I read them. And I will certainly read the next trilogy. They're currently re-released in audiobook, and I think the third one will come out in December. So when that happens, I'll probably go and read the second trilogy and see where we're progressing with this and how this moves on in the next book. And we'll see that. And look, I managed to not even talk about Lena and sexual assault, which I will talk about in that other video if I make it, because there's something to be talked about there. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. If you've read the book, let me know what you think. Let's have a discussion. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, share. If you feel incredibly generous, join the Patreon. I'll try to actually make that more worthwhile for you in the future. And, see you in the next one. Cheers.